On July 22nd, 2025, the world would be notified of the death of Ozzy Osbourne. I was on my way home from work when it happened, and after pulling up to the house, I picked up my phone, viewing the words "Ozzy died" and a push notification from a good friend on X. I kinda sat there for a moment, not surprised, but instead mostly stunned at how cinematic the entire thing was playing out. A few days earlier, just over 2 weeks after Back to the Beginning, I gave my recap and commentary in a video here on the channel. I got to eulogize a little bit the career of Black Sabbath and the Prince of Darkness, but not a monumental death. Ozzy was a big part of discussions and commentaries because of the show, so many of us have been giving thoughts for months now, but this was different and changed the context of everything in an instant. All of the hawk and hyperbole about the icon getting to write his final chapter became an even more fitting description, as Ozzy Osbourne quite literally gave everything he had left. His effort leading up to and during the show was said to have been quite a battle, and weeks later, he died of cardiac arrest. Seeing Ozzy's legacy megaphoned across the world and getting to look at the many different ways that people remembered the legend was awesome. Maybe it's just the algorithmic overlords, but it felt like for days after the announcement, everyone agreed on something for the first time in recent memory, left, right, or otherwise, and all of the divisive trash was stowed away to honor the legacy of one of music's most important icons and pop culture's most lovable madman. This collection of stories, chronicling an insane short period at the beginning of 1982, was meant to put on wax the stories that cemented Ozzy Osbourne as the Prince of Darkness and solidified his mythological legacy for the decades that would follow it. It was a true reconstruction of a figure many hailed as heavy metal's very beginning, turning Ozzy from former Black Sabbath frontman to a certified madman and enemy of all things holy in the first half of the Satanic Panic. It is, in my opinion, the most important group of stories in Ozzy Osbourne's solo career, and what better way to honor the Titan than being yet another in a long line of storytellers to chronicle them. To chronicle Ozzy Osbourne's entire career would take ages, from his contributions to the fabric of heavy metal musically, to the persona that would inspire millions, to his love for the stage and scream of the crowd. He is an undeniable legend. But beyond being a magnet for amazing musical collaborators like Randy Rhoads and Bob Daisley, he would build, across 2 decades, a mythology surrounding his extracurricular escapades. As a teller of crazy rock star stories, who better to focus on than the Prince of Darkness himself? Today, we're going to forego the simple biography to go beyond the music, dig into some of the rock star stories he's left in his wake, and take a look at the beginning of 1982 and go over how it's gone on to define the Prince of Darkness's mythological image. Ozzy Osbourne would begin the 1980s in a hole, without a band, and wondering what to do with the shaky reputation he was left with, and he would end it as a well-established heavy metal god, the Prince of Darkness, and probably most importantly, a mythologically insane madman. To set the stage for the wild career of Ozzy Osbourne, it's important to plot out the wild ride that was the 1970s. Retrospectively, it's easy to categorize Ozzy's career as meteoric, as I often do, but as it was happening, he faced a host of demons that came hand in hand with nearly unstoppable success. Black Sabbath would dominate the decade, establishing heavy metal itself as a force to be reckoned with, spawning whole branches of the genre and stamping their legacy right onto rock music's very foundation. Ozzy, as a frontman, was flamboyant and eccentric, setting precedents for the role just as much as others in rock music at the time. But it was all accompanied by predatory record deals, cocktails of illicit substances, and infighting between the Birmingham native lads. By the end of the 1970s, Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, while conquering metal music over the decade, were spiraling out of control, strung out, and at a loss for how to move forward. Years prior, as the band was in between records, Ozzy had walked out on the heavy metal juggernauts. Even though this resulted in Sabbath auditioning replacements, Ozzy rejoined just in time to begin work on the final Black Sabbath record of the decade, Never Say Die. Ozzy, Tony, Geezer, and Bill were spent, unable to work together and clearly phoning in their contributions, risking the tarnishing of everything they'd built over the decade. Ozzy particularly was failing to keep it together, apparently more so than the remaining trio, and drummer Bill Ward, Ozzy's best friend, was tasked with delivering the final blow to what should have been Ozzy's rock bottom. Unknown at the time, cutting Ozzy loose to drunkenly stumble into the unknown would be the best decision for both parties. Black Sabbath would recruit the already legendary Ronnie James Dio, spawning an era of Black Sabbath that fans argue over to this day. As for Ozzy Osbourne, he would proceed to retreat and isolate himself from the world, digging himself deeper and deeper into his demons, and posing a risk of failure to anyone willing to work with him. But his saving grace would come from Sharon Arden, the daughter of Jet Records executive Don Arden, and with Black Sabbath being signed to them, she would see something in the pile of despair that Ozzy had become. With sway in the industry due to her lineage, she would convince her father to take a chance, a big chance, on Ozzy. They set out to build a band around the disgraced former Black Sabbath icon. That project would be monikered Blizzard of Oz, a band that was meant to feature Ozzy Osbourne along with Quiet Riot guitarist Randy Rhoads, bassist Bob Daisley, and drummer Lee Kerslake. And while Ozzy was meant to be a central selling point for this new band, Blizzard of Oz, unintentional and unfortunate for the members who weren't Ozzy Osbourne, a misprinting of the album cover upon its official 1980 release would result in the perception of an Ozzy Osbourne solo record titled Blizzard of Oz, which is how it sits in the history books today, as it was deceptively put together by the record label. As awesome as it would be to dive deeper into what would follow all of these events, I'm sure there's very little I could tell you about it that you don't already know. Ozzy Osbourne, from the triumph of every album he released over the decade to the questionable treatment that Sharon and the band management would inflict upon Daisley, Lee, and a host of other contributors, one thing was certain: Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, was absolutely on top of the world of heavy metal.
The former leader of Black Sabbath, Ozzy Osbourne, is known for his frenetic stage performances and his outlandish antics. It says here, the word madman almost always precedes his name. Welcome, please, Madman Ozzy Osbourne.
After his ousting from Black Sabbath, Ozzy had a name and persona that needed a bit of PR work. In 1981, at a staged press event in Los Angeles for a group of record executives, arranged by Sharon as a flashy cleansing of his darker public image, Ozzy was meant to theatrically release a set of doves into the air during his time at the podium. Instead, an extremely intoxicated Ozzy Osbourne thought it was a far more exciting idea to bite their heads off in front of a terrified group of white-collar normies, leaving everyone horrified and kicking off a proper decade of insanity and beginning a trend of sorts that would go on to cement itself to its legacy. And as such, one event above all others would contribute to the legend of Ozzy Osbourne in a way that nearly no other recounting of his antics has. Perhaps even well and beyond his undeniable musical contributions, this one night and impulsive decision has been seared into heavy metal culture itself. It's been superglued to his image, reluctantly embraced by his branding, and likely to come to mind immediately the moment the Prince of Darkness is uttered to nearly anyone who was alive in the 80s or has become interested in metal music since. The fucking bat. Now, look, I understand this is a story that has been told to death by me even, and it wouldn't surprise me if every single person watching this right now knows everything I'm about to say, but it just further points to how integral it has been to Ozzy's legacy of madness. It would be criminal to ignore it, and I'm gonna tell it. But first, a message from our sponsors. I'm just kidding. No one would pay for this. In January of 1982, while on tour in the United States promoting his sophomore release, Diary of a Madman, Ozzy Osbourne bit the head off of a bat on stage in Des Moines, Iowa. It is easily not only one of Ozzy's most infamous tales, but has managed to transcend headbanger culture into the general zeitgeist. And while starting here would seem to be leading with my best material, it's the start of a whirlwind set of antics that would etch Ozzy's name even deeper into the halls of human history. It's been talked about and telephoned to death, both denounced and embraced by Ozzy's camp themselves, and I can almost guarantee that if you know nothing at all about Ozzy Osbourne, you know this story. The full story would take decades to surface, despite the bat smuggler coming forward to claim his fame months later, and even still, I'm skeptical that I've nailed it down, but the events of that evening, as a matter of chronology, go something like this. The night of the show, 17-year-old Mark Neal and a group of his buddies were excited to see the Prince of Darkness do what he does best. He concocted a plan to smuggle a bat, one that he had found dead a week prior, into the venue for the express purpose of getting it onto the stage. So I imagine he wasn't expecting the night to be quite as historical as it turned out. He told any and everyone about what he was planning to do, and his friends were determined to help him achieve it in what would otherwise simply be a funny story for them to tell about a crazy night they had in high school at an Ozzy Osbourne concert. He and the group got as close as they could, front row, right at the feet of bassist Rudy Sarzo. Choosing their timing wisely, they chucked the bat onto the stage, landing in front of the former Quiet Riot bass player, who looked at it puzzled, trying to figure out what it was. Once it clicked with him, he nodded Ozzy over to take a gander, and well, Ozzy picked it up and bit its fucking head off. As of recent interviews, the most annoying question Ozzy has asked repeatedly is, how do bats taste? Salty, apparently. And as he bit down on the poor thing's head, swearing it to be alive, though not only was it indeed dead, it had been dead for 2 weeks, being held by Neil for the explicit purpose of tossing it onto the stage, he would get a full palate rundown of rotten bat corpse as the blood entered his mouth and his stomach hit the floor. He would be rushed to the hospital, undergoing a full shakedown of rabies vaccinations to prevent the obvious, and would go on to claim in later interviews that he thought the bat was a rubber toy prop, and, well, he was just very impulsive. A week later, on stage, Ozzy would reportedly have a bad reaction associated with his rabies treatment, collapsing, and I'm pretty sure it's also why he shaved his head in the time surrounding the incident. He would continue to truck on as the media lit up about his apparent insanity, and what better way to sell your heavy metal records than upsetting everyone? His name was in the minds of every parent and the mouths of every headbanger, and it would kick off a blending of fact and fiction that would build his infamous persona. Most famously, perhaps, was his appearance on Letterman to talk about it, taking advantage of the growing mythos surrounding him. Along with the sheer talent on display with Randy Rhoads and Diary of a Madman, the buzz created was enormous. Any press is good press, and Ozzy wasn't looking to lay low, and good lord, would that indeed be the case. The blowout success didn't pull Ozzy out of his proclivities. Keeping the icon reeled in was a full-time job in itself for the future Mrs. Osbourne, Sharon Arden. In February of 1982, on the very same Diary of a Madman tour, a stop in San Antonio, Texas, would result in further nationwide infamy among parents in the haze of satanic panic, and prove Ozzy Osbourne to be the perfect tool of rebellion to the era's teenagers. The culture of the rock star lifestyle, while being nothing new, was ramping up as the younger generations of bands began to see the early stages of mega success. This fit right in with Ozzy's proclivities, so after another successful show in San Antonio, the partying would begin, eventually seeing the Prince of Darkness back in his hotel room, confronted by his manager and future wife, who desperately wanted him to sleep it off and stay out of trouble. To this end, Sharon would take all of Ozzy's clothing, leaving him in a stumbling and stark state, hoping this would discourage him from wandering off and getting into the trouble that the man was destined to seek out. But ever the creative soul, Ozzy would discover Sharon's clothes instead, and feeling no shame in gender-bending fashion, would don one of her dresses and wobble his way through the San Antonio evening. Heavily drinking all night, Ozzy needed to relieve himself, and finding a public restroom was a task he wasn't willing to take on. Leaning against what he believed to be a nearby wall, he pulled up his beautiful dress and let rip. However, that nearby wall was the cenotaph, a sacred monument honoring the Texas Revolution and those who died during the 1836 Battle of the Alamo. It sits in the Alamo Plaza, not far from the building itself, and Texans do not fuck around with their state pride. The Alamo was one of the state's proudest landmarks, and the mistake would go down as one of Ozzy's more infamous. The disrespect of the honored location would result in him being arrested and charged with public intoxication after urinating on the Alamo cenotaph. It would also be coupled with a ban from the city itself, something they held up for a decade before allowing Ozzy to return in the early 90s after many apologies and a hefty donation to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas, the group responsible for maintaining the Alamo. Locally, the stunt would be taken personally, but as the story spread to rags across the world, it was sensationalized in an environment far less transparent than it is now, and would grow into legends as the decades went on. For such a simple mistake, one that I'm sure plenty of drunk idiots have done themselves, Ozzy's status as the Prince of Darkness and his place in heavy metal history would make him the perfect target for outrage, especially since it wasn't even the craziest thing he did that year. This single month in Ozzy's career would result in two of heavy metal's most infamous tales, and along with the great music that accompanied it, as well as the impending tragedy that loomed on the horizon, he was a household name for both wrong and right reasons depending on who you are. It would be an ultimate selling point for headbangers and would play well into the marketing of the madman Ozzy Osbourne was turning out to be.
And this little guy comes in with blonde hair, and I thought, is that a chick? He spoke, oh, wow. Suddenly my ears pricked back. He says, well, what do you want me to play? I says, play anything. So he starts playing, and I'm like, even in my drunken, stoned out stupid, I go, oh, this is fucking one of the best things I've ever heard in my life. Or these drugs are really good.
In the present day, well beyond the satanic panic of the 1980s and into the satanic panic of the 2020s, these events are mythologically goofy, to put it lightly. While they are a bit gross and silly, it's a staple of Ozzy Osbourne's beloved personality to be exactly that, along with being a stage presence well worth the time and money to experience. All of this just a few years into what, at first, felt like the end of the world, but as talents were brought in to build what was meant to be Blizzard of Oz, one stood out as more memorable in the history books than arguably any other musician Osbourne would recruit going forward: Randy Rhoads. Rhoads was pressured by a friend to audition, as he knew Randy's talents and what a major opportunity it would be to rip chords for Black Sabbath's Ozzy Osbourne. When he did finally take the leap, he would barely make it through tuning his guitar before being offered the job. It's a legendary story that would kick off an equally iconic few years for both Randy Rhoads and Ozzy Osbourne. The freshman record for this budding new outfit would end with all of the focus being on Ozzy Osbourne as a solo artist, relegating Blizzard of Oz to the position of backing band and album title. Despite the writing efforts being spread across Osbourne, Rhoads, Bob Daisley, and Lee Kerslake, it would be the beginning of some cutthroat treatment for the revolving door of supporting artists, but that's a story for another day. The follow-up, Diary of a Madman, would see Randy Rhoads shining even brighter as he brought his classical style and stellar technical ability to heavy metal, fronted by one of the genre's founding fathers, and welcomed with open arms, sore necks, and ringing ears, and stands today as arguably the best record Ozzy would release over the course of the entire decade. The supporting tour brings us back to the whirlwind introductions in 1982 and the insane stories that cemented Ozzy Osbourne's legacy of madness. Among the discussion for that tour, management intended to record a live album of Black Sabbath covers featuring this talented new lineup and allowing profits from Ozzy's work in Black Sabbath to be appropriated. All of this followed legal windows opening after Black Sabbath's predatory contracts and all too common reality in the music industry left the band's founding members taken advantage of. But with the success of Ozzy's new venture and the familiarity and proven track record of songs like Paranoid and War Pigs, it seemed like an equalizer. An equalizer for Ozzy, not for Rhoads and the rest of the band. Feeling they had proven themselves a worthy separate act, it was insulting to Ozzy's new crew, who had already ended up being demoted to backing a solo act. It was a tension and strain that ultimately would never have the chance to be resolved, but Randy's legacy was for certain cemented in March of 1982 for the worst of reasons. While touring the US and making a stop in their tour buses in Leesburg, Florida, bus driver and former pilot Andrew Aycock, along with makeup artist Rachel Youngblood and the 25-year-old Randy Rhoads, would get up to some crazy rock and roll antics in a nearby airplane hangar. Aycock would convince Youngblood and Rhoads to tag along with him, buzzed and full of mischief as he commandeered a small prop plane, a Beechcraft F-35, and took to the shallow skies for a joyride. And what is assumed to be a playful but perilous practical joke, Aycock with the prop plane would follow closely behind the tour bus carrying Ozzy Osbourne, making attempts to, quote, buzz the bus and rattle those inside for a goof. After 2 or 3 successful swipes, a fateful final attempt would result in the plane's left wing hitting the bus, causing the aircraft to crash into a pine tree on its way to its final crash site in a nearby garage. All 3 of the occupants on board would be killed on impact. It's one of rock music's most notorious incidents, and would cut short a more than promising career for Rhoads, as well as cascading pain and loss through the countless lives of all 3 victims' families, as well as the adoring public in love with the guitarist at the precipice of what was sure to be an amazing career and catalog. It would have Ozzy in the headlines once again in a short 3-month period for all of the wrong reasons, and I would guess was the most traumatic event of the icon's entire career. And while we know in the present day that Ozzy went on to even more meteoric heights without Randy Rhoads, there's a great chance that none of that success would be written quite the same way. Being a mythological maniac will sell tickets once or twice, here and there, but without genuinely great music to hook the public in with, it eventually gets old and tired. It's a tale as old as entertainment itself. Exactly how great that music is in the ears of the listener, and a subjective battle of commentary that is sure to rage on for decades to come, as it has for decades already. But it isn't a stretch to look back at Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman as Ozzy's best solo records, and considering the longevity and stratospheric success of songs like Crazy Train, you would be hard-pressed to argue otherwise. The remainder of the 1980s would see Ozzy Osbourne moving on to certified classics like Bark at the Moon and No Rest for the Wicked, taking on amazing talents like Jake Ely and Zakk Wylde to fill their track lists, and all while being held up by televangelists and parents as the manifestation of the devil himself. It was the perfect persona for a youth bucking against the uptight, morally panicked public. A generation filled with Cold War anxiety and politics, the emergence of MTV and music videos, and a fracturing of the heavy metal genre into everything from hair metal to crossover thrash. Ozzy, after spending the 70s helping build heavy metal itself as a titan of rock music, now conquered and blueprinted the rock star archetype that so many would go on to copy and attempt to outdo. But these 3 months and the madness that Ozzy found himself consumed by are arguably the most important 3 months in the icon's half-century career at the top of the heavy metal food chain. The image of the Prince of Darkness was molded here and quenched by tragedy, only to be built upon even more as the decades progressed. Each generation of headbangers would have their own version of Ozzy Osbourne, as he made sure to remain at the forefront of popular culture through projects like Ozzfest, reality TV magic with the Osbournes, and of course his workhorse work ethic, releasing record after record, something I am certain that not even his death will halt. Ozzy Osbourne was, is, and will remain a Mount Rushmore figure in the world of rock and metal, and it's a legacy that I'm honored to be given the platform to recount to you guys. Now, while these stories barely scratch the surface in the totality of his life, they are undeniably the most memorable. In 2007, when I was 16 years old, Ozzfest was offered to the masses with free admission. As Florida trailer trash, it was the only chance I was going to get to go, and the tour's final show took place in West Palm Beach, and it was a bit of a hike. More than any of my connections were willing to drive, and while lamenting my misfortune in my social studies class with my best friend Josh, a kid we had never spoken to or knew at all turned to us and offered to take us, as he and his mom were planning to go. We convinced our parents and took a chance, and on the ride up, all Josh and I cared about was that we were going to get to see Ozzy Osbourne. The kid giving us a ride wasn't much of an Ozzy fan, but we were super grateful that he had brought us along. The whole day is an insane story on its own, but the most vivid moment in my mind from that night, as the opening riffage of Bark at the Moon exploded from Zakk Wylde's Grail Les Paul, the kid gets a confused look on his face at the crowd's reaction and asks, "What song is this?" And I almost lost my shit. We left that night, vibrating, and convinced that we were ready to drop dead right there, having fulfilled all that life was going to give us. From discovering Black Sabbath to breaking down my opinion on Back to the Beginning, Ozzy Osbourne has been a mainstay in my life, as he was with millions of others, many of you being among them. Calculating the impact is going to vary, depending on the person, but it is undeniable that the Prince of Darkness was an essential element to millions of lives. Henry Rollins told a story about meeting Ozzy backstage once, well into his solidified icon status, fretting over whether or not anyone would actually be out there when he went on stage. It's a crazy thing to think that he would be worried in the slightest, but it says to me that Ozzy Osbourne was a man who desperately wanted attention, but was always astonished that everyone continued to give it to him. It's the perfect combination of arrogance and humility that results in a one-of-a-kind talent and artist who was essential to rock and metal music. To move forward now in life, knowing that he's gone and that the book is closed on the Diary of a Madman, it sucks. Say what you will about that sentiment, but I know I'm not alone in expressing it.